Good morning and welcome to our forum on faith and politics. Our presenter this morning is St. Paul President J. Simmons. Jay has spent most of his career in United Methodist higher education. After graduating from Birmingham Southern College, he worked for 8 years in academic affairs office while pursuing his PhD in politics at the University of Alabama. Following an 8-month detour into public education, he served 11 years as the vice president for academic affairs at LaGrange College near Atlanta, and then served 5 years as the president of Iowa Wesleyan College, and then 6.5 years as president of Simpson College in the beautiful town of Indianola, Iowa. Dr. Simmons joined St. Paul as the vice president for institutional advancement in July 2020 and began serving as president on January 1st, 2024. Since 2016, Dr. Simmons has served as the chair of the Commission on Institutional Review for the University Senate of the United Methodist Church. Dr. Simmons will speak for approximately 35 minutes and then have a time of questions and discussion. Please welcome President J. Simmons.
Thank you, Karen. Well, I have to tell you all, it dawned on me about a week ago that this is probably one of the dumber invitations I have ever accepted. We are 2 weeks from an election in which comity and amiability reign supreme in the United States. And acknowledging that, I thought, this is going to be so depressing. Maybe we should do something fun, like talk about Crimson Tide football. But given the way my team looks this fall, that didn't sound like such a great option either. So we're stuck back at the original topic on faith and politics. So what I'd like to do in the time that we're together and have some discussion is look at how the relationship between faith and politics has changed. And I really hesitate to do this with a bunch of theologians because you guys are going to be smirking at me for the next 35 or 40 minutes as I say some of these things. But how the relationship between faith and politics shifted from the pre-modern to the modern era. And as all of us know, we are in a postmodern era. We haven't quite defined what that means yet. But modernism, as we have known it for centuries, is crumbling rapidly. So we're going somewhere else, not quite sure. And if what we're seeing happening right now is a harbinger of things to come, it is not a good place to go. So just to define a little bit about what I mean by modern, pre-modern, and so forth in the Christian era. Some people will argue that around 1400 with Machiavelli and the Prince, that was a decided shift toward modernity. Because in the Prince, it was the first major political treatise in which God did not feature. Others will argue that it happened around 1600 when Thomas Hobbes came along, introduced the state of nature, and we'll get into that more momentarily. But it was also when the Dutch developed the sinking debt fund and invented world capitalism and laid the foundations for the world economy in which we all still live. That hasn't changed fundamentally in over 4 centuries now. So that's roughly what I mean by the modern era. This distinction is important in terms of the relationship between faith and politics for a couple of reasons. But perhaps more than any other reason for us today is it is a direct part of what we're all debating in the United States and will be for the next 2 weeks and long after November the 5th. As you all know as well as I do, this nation is fundamentally polarized about who we are and what our identity is and who we should be. We are hearing calls for the return of this nation to its Christian foundations. We're going to talk about that in some detail, I think, I hope over the next few minutes, and what that does and does not mean in the context of American politics and how our tradition of politics intersects with issues of faith. I take it as axiomatic that faith and politics have always been and continue to be interrelated and inseparable. The dynamics of that relationship change over time, and they are markedly different now than they were prior to 1600 or 1400. And sometimes people will say, well, that's not really true. And they'll throw out the example of the Soviet Union, in which atheism was the official doctrine of the Soviet Union and so forth. Well, that's fine. Atheism is simply another expression of faith. And if we're going to talk about Marxist ideology and theory, what are history and what are history other than expressions of a greater being, a supernatural being? They're simply substitutions for those things. Then we can talk about Marxism as merely the secular expression of Christianity anyway. And that's been done by theologians and political theorists for the last 150 years. So for all of those reasons, I think it's fair to say, at least in my mind, there's no distinction between those periods, officially communist doctrine, and anything else that we have done in centuries of political activity on this planet, at least in the Western tradition. So let's talk a little bit, if we might, how does politics work in a few examples in the pre-Christian era? And I was putting together my notes, and I kept thinking about Dr. Quam, who has been reminding us with some regularity in recent weeks that we are rapidly approaching the 1700th anniversary of the Council of Nicaea. That council settled issues. Theologians might say, well, we didn't quite settle things, but fair enough point. But settled some issues that continue to reverberate through the definitions of Christianity even today, and will for the life of Christian theology probably until the end of time. However, when Constantine sought that council in 325, he had some overriding political concerns that he wanted to address. And you all know this. Any of you who have had any church history know these parts as well or better than I do. A political problem for Constantine was that he had bishops in Antioch, Rome, Jerusalem, and so on, vying with one another for supremacy within the early Christian church. For Constantine, that was a political problem. He engaged in the theological debates. There's a lot of evidence that some of the things he did basically shut down debate. He said, no, guys, this is the way it's going to be in the empire. For whatever reasons, he saw that as fundamental to the integrity of the empire over time. Now, we can debate the efficacy and the wisdom of what he did. However, I think it might be fair to say that Constantine's influence on the interaction of faith and politics enjoyed some success, notwithstanding the Great Schism of 1054, notwithstanding the iconography disputes within the Orthodox Church. Still, the empire made it another 1100 years. So you could make the argument that Constantine knew what he was doing in seeking this settlement between faith and politics, and using faith in a way that drove the politics of the empire for over a millennium. Moving ahead just a bit, not too much though, because when you think about the Constantinople falling in 1454, we're kind of at that point when we start talking about the Reformation. Politics clearly were driven by issues of faith during the Reformation. Not only do we have the Reformation, we had the Counter-Reformation, all of the issues attendant to that, the wars of religion that ravaged much of Europe, particularly France, for decades. And then it wasn't until the Edict of Nantes, issued by Henry IV, that we actually saw an easing of some of those tensions. But religion still played a dominant and dominating role in the politics of the time. We only need to think about the consequences of Henry VIII's decision to divorce Catherine of Aragon to understand the impact that those issues had on society and the way people lived throughout the Western world during that time. Then we move ahead a little bit more in the pre-modern era, and we're getting closer to the dividing line in my mind in terms of the intellectual history of these issues. European monarchies had long justified their existence by monarch being in God's favor, and having the favor and the support of the church. The politics of Europe were defined by those issues for decades and centuries, until finally we get to James Stewart promulgating in its most articulate and ardent form the theory of the divine right of kings. So in the True Law of Free Monarchies, the work he produced articulating this concept, James stated that the king sits on the throne because he has been given a divine dispensation directly by God. And that dispensation, because it comes from God, cannot be interfered with by any human or any human institution. Now, we look at that and say, well, there's a perfect formula for absolute dictatorship. And that's what James meant, was exactly that. Well, think about the power of that idea. Eventually, the idea of the divine right of kings in the Western world and in Christianity was curtailed. But think of what it took to do it. We had to see the deposition and the beheading of Charles I, the English Civil Wars, the restoration of Charles II, and then finally, the English peerage negotiated a deal with William of Orange that resulted in the Glorious Revolution of 1688. And it was only then that the idea of the divine right of kings actually got some bounds around it. So that when the Glorious Revolution came about, we start seeing the gradual rise of what we now think of as a constitutional monarchy in much of Western Europe, but particularly in Britain thereafter. So that gets us up to about 1700, right? 1688 for the Glorious Revolution. Let's back up about a century, though, and go to 1588. And this is when we start seeing what I think of as the real break from the pre-modern era. It was at about this time in 1588 that Thomas Hobbes was born. And it's probably apocryphal. I think it's Aubrey in the Brief Lives that says Hobbes was born when his mother had a sighting, when she was pregnant with him, and had a sighting of the Spanish Armada approaching Britain, and she panicked and went into labor, and thus was born Thomas Hobbes. Probably apocryphal, but it's a great story. And it does sort of set the stage for the rest of Hobbes's life. The reason Hobbes is important in this context is the state of nature. Some of you may, if you don't know Thomas Hobbes, you will know this phrase. Hobbes wrote that life in the state of nature, which is a philosophical construct that we'll talk about more in a second, suggested that in the state of nature, life is poor, nasty, brutish, and short. And his idea in the state of nature is, and pay attention to this part because he never makes reference to any supernatural entity of any kind. He posits that there was a prehistorical time when we as human beings existed in what was in effect perfect liberty and perfect anarchy. We all got killed because there was no law, there was no power to stop us from, I see Dr. Huang's steak dinner and I really like it, I'm going to take it. And if she doesn't like it, too bad. And then so she stabs me to death to get her dinner back. And that's the state of nature. It's a rough, rough place. See, y'all didn't know this about Dr. Long, right?
No, we have a
But the point is, it is a brutal, brutal place to live. Because we are given the power of reason. Again, no reference to the supernatural. We have the power of reason. And enough of us can look at each other and go, there's got to be a better way. We've seen that Dr. Huang's pretty good with a knife. Why don't we all agree that we're going to be subservient to her and she will be our sovereign? She will guarantee our safety and security, and in return, we will give up our liberty. That's the first real. Now, there are other promulgations of social contracts earlier in the history of ideas, but this one is the most well-developed and probably the best articulated idea of the social contract. John Locke writes one a little later that's much friendlier and less harsh, but it's the same basic outline. This revolutionized the understanding of the interplay between faith and politics. Because for the first time, we had a major thinker saying, let's let the politics be the dominant factor here. The fact that Hobbes never made reference to any spiritual power got him in more trouble than any else can probably imagine. He spent the rest of his life literally running back and forth across the English Channel to escape death warrants on him issued by the monarchs on both sides of the channel, because he just made everybody mad. And he would get back in good graces on one side, and then he'd make them mad and have to go back to the other side. Amazingly, he died an old man in his sleep.
Hmm.
So, with that idea of the state of nature, we start to see some changes in the way theorists and thinkers see the way polities work and what the role of faith and religion should be within the context of the polity. Michel Foucault talked about shifts like this as being epistemic, obviously drawing on the word epistemology. How do you know what you think you know? For Foucault and the others of the French Annales School, this was a period that marked a fundamental shift in power relationships and the way human beings perceive how the world works and how the deity works in the world. Now, this gets very important because as we approach the founding of the American Republic, we have to remember that if we put ourselves in that time, these ideas were all very fresh, very current, and very, very much pressing on the minds of people who were thinking about what politics means in a contemporary setting in the 18th century. So before we get quite there, there are a couple of things that we need to think about as these ideas develop, particularly in the form of the Enlightenment, as we get up through the 17th, 18th century, and thinkers like Rousseau, Diderot, Voltaire, and that crew start writing about the intersection of faith and politics. The church, and in this context, the Catholic Church, was seen as corrupt and corrupting in civilizations, particularly in France. And when you look at the history, it's easy to see why. The Enlightenment thinkers like Voltaire were generally friendly to ideas about faith, but they were extremely skeptical to ideas about religion. One of the most wonderful descriptions I think I've ever read about the nature of God, or a description of God, comes from Voltaire when he wrote, "God is a circle whose center is everywhere and circumference nowhere." Now contrast that idea. This is one of the most skeptical, critical minds alive. Contrast that idea, though. Of religion, he wrote, "You will notice that in all disputes between Christians since the birth of the church, Rome has always favored the doctrine which most completely subjugated the human mind and annihilated reason." And that is a critical concept in this whole shift, is the power of reason. Hobbes started working with that in the state of nature. The Enlightenment thinkers pick it up. And the idea is that as human beings, God has endowed us with the gift of reason. Now, it holds up about as well over time as the idea of the rational economic actor in the early to mid 20th century, but still, we got it. And it kind of influenced everything for a while. So, I don't mean to make the whole argument rest on two quotes from Voltaire, but it does give you a sense of what these thinkers were concerned about and what they were writing. Voltaire also knew and was critical of religion because he was only years removed from the wars of religion himself. And so he wrote. And remember, the wars of religion, you've got the Huguenots, the Catholics going head to head, killing each other right and left. Brutal. He wrote, "If you have two religions in your land, the two will cut each other's throats. But if you have 30 religions, they will dwell in peace." That's important in this whole context. Because we get to Philadelphia and we encounter a group of men, and I say that advisedly, a group of men, propertied, wealthy, white men, who gathered in what we now know as Constitution Hall, and they went to work. These individuals were more than familiar with the Enlightenment writers, Hobbes, the ideas of the state of nature. This was all second nature to them. They gathered in one another's homes, they gathered in salons, they traveled to Europe and had intellectual discussions, and these were the foundations for their intellectual exchanges when they gathered in these settings. So, you take this group, you get a sense of what they're thinking about, you get a sense of where their concerns are. They're going to be skeptical of organized religion. They are going to acknowledge that there probably is something to faith, that it is probably not a great idea to inject politics with an overabundance with religious issues because of what they had seen going on in the previous couple of centuries. And then they had read all of the Enlightenment thinkers, plus Montesquieu, who is particularly important in this sense. There were other writers who wrote constitutional works, and more research is suggesting they could have been as important or even more important than Montesquieu. But let's go with Montesquieu for the moment, because he is the one that we all hear about. Montesquieu wrote The Spirit of the Laws, and he laid the philosophical foundations for what became our Constitution in many ways. He's certainly emblematic of it, even though others had a good part to play as well. And what Montesquieu suggested was simply this: natural laws are ordained by God. The fact that we possess reason is a part of that natural law fabric. God gave that to us. The planets orbit the sun. That's part of God's natural law. We credit God with that. We praise God for that. But the rest of it's on us. Montesquieu's thought was this: we can't blame God for the mistakes that we make in our politics. That's not God's job. And in fact, better that we focus on that because of what we've seen happen since the rise of Christianity in the early years of, the second, third centuries, right? Too many abuses, too much violence. Let's take that out of it. And let's try to create institutions that we cultivate through our reason. And through the application of our reason, we create these institutions in ways that they are not as prone to human fallibility. And thus we get the checks and balances system that we see in the Constitution today. Let's put in safeguards. Let's let you guys be the judicial aspect of government. You guys be the legislative, and you guys be the executive. And we'll make sure you each have a sphere of influence and that you can say no to the other. That protects us from ourselves. That's not God's job, it's our job. So, when you take all of that and you look at that intellectual context, you get to Philadelphia, you get to the Constitution Hall, and you've got a group of individuals who look at religion and say, it's got a place, it's not the government. So they go into Constitution Hall. They are not necessarily devout Christians, and that is critically important today. We're hearing too many people say too many times, America has gone astray. We must return to our Christian roots. And until we do, we will continue to go down this path toward Armageddon. Look at the people who put the documents together. Benjamin Franklin probably wrote more theological tracts than anybody among the framers. as you look through those documents, he wasn't writing about Christianity per se. He was writing about how do we take what seemed to be the best ideas from the religions around the world and live according to those. Deism was particularly popular in the colonial era. When you look at the way Franklin wrote, it's likely he was more deist than Christian. Thomas Jefferson, no question about his deism. Jefferson was so committed to the power of reason in the Enlightenment sense that he took the Bible and he created a book that he called The Life and Morals of Jesus of Nazareth. It's not an interpretation, it is an excision. He literally took a razor and cut out the parts of the Bible that he thought didn't make sense, which were any references to supernatural acts, miracles, and any historical pieces that he just assumed the evangelist got wrong. You can buy a copy from the Smithsonian today. Clearly a deist at heart, friendly toward the idea of faith, friendly toward the idea of some supernatural deity, not necessarily wedded to Christianity. Similarly with George Washington, so-called father of the nation, right? He was a member of the Church of England. That's well documented, no doubt about it. However, he almost never referred to God. Like the deists of the period, he almost always spoke about providence, which was the deist description for the deity. So, can it be any surprise to anybody that we get to 1789, the year of the French Revolution, and Thomas Jefferson is working in the Virginia General Assembly and is drafted to promulgate the Virginia Statute on Religious Freedom. And it states in that document, all men shall be free to profess and by argument to maintain their opinion in matters of religion. And it prohibited the state of Virginia from establishing any denomination or interfering with individuals' religious belief. It's walled off. And that word wall becomes important momentarily. Jefferson wrote that his intent in formulating the statute, and forgive the language of the time, but this was the language of the time. Jefferson wrote that his intent in formulating the statute was to ensure religious freedom to, quote, the Jew, the Gentile, the Christian, the Mohammedan, the Hindu, and infidel of every denomination. In other words, your choice of faith is a matter for your conscience. It is not a matter for the state. Certainly not the state of Virginia. So, Kaylee, may I trouble you for that first slide with the First Amendment? So, when they all get to Constitution Hall and start hanging out together, it's inevitable that they're going to write, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. It's almost ordained that they're going to come to this conclusion. And then those other things that we don't seem to like much lately either, about the freedom of speech, freedom of the press, and right of peaceable assembly and so forth. Those are getting troublesome too lately for some folks. But anyway, all of that to say, they reflected the spirit of the time, a modernist sense and sensibility about the role of faith and the role of politics in the community. A few years later, in 1802, Jefferson wrote to the Danbury Baptist Association in Danbury, Virginia, where Janae and I once went, that the intent of the, quote, wall of separation was to prohibit the government from establishing any religion and to guarantee religious freedom for individuals. That's the first time we see the phrase described in quite that way, the wall of separation, that's what he's talking about. So to claim that the founders, as some are doing in our political discourse today, were ardent Christians is historically inaccurate and false. They were friendly to faith. They wanted faith to be a part of individuals. But they also saw that it was a matter because of the differences we all bring to matters of faith, because of our traditions and backgrounds. Probably wasn't a great idea to use it as the foundation for the political community. It also ignores that argument a couple of other things that are inimical to Christianity. Look at the document itself. The Connecticut Compromise is inherently an anti-democratic measure. Why should the people of Wyoming, who all 400,000 of them, vote for 2 senators, while the people of California, all 48 or whatever million of them, vote for 2 senators? In comparison, folks in California's votes are almost worthless compared to someone in Wyoming. It is inherently anti-democratic. That's problematic from the perspective of Christian theology when you consider that in the early years of the Roman Empire, the appeal of Christianity, particularly to women and to the enslaved, was its emphasis on equality. Similarly, the 3/5 compromise, that enslaved persons are worth only 3/5 as much as a slave-owning person. That is not a Christian concept. And yet they agreed to it. So, for those reasons and others, it's hard to say that we have to return to some Christian root and that the Constitution is being abrogated because we are not returning to those roots. In fact, the opposite is true. So, when you think of those aspects of our history, when you think about where we have been and what all of this means for the formulation of our founding documents, which is problematic at best. The Constitution is a problematic document. But these were not individuals who left Constitution Hall thinking that they were bringing down the hottest thing since Moses came down from Mount Sinai. They had been locked up in a building for weeks in an unusually hot summer. They had closed up all the doors. They had closed the windows because they didn't want anybody to see what they were doing. They met in secret because they were violating the authorization that Congress had extended to them to fix the Articles of Confederation. They usurped the authority of the Congress at the time, which is no big deal because they did rebel against their king too. So that's what seemed easy, right? But the point simply is, he didn't come out of that room thinking, man, God was telling us what to do with this document. That was not their perspective. So knowing these aspects of our history then, how do we respond? How do we understand some of the things that are going wrong in our American politics today? How do we understand the rise of Christian nationalism? How do we understand groups like the New Apostolic Reformation? How do we understand the agenda of persons like Oklahoma State Superintendent for Education Ryan Walker, who's mandated that all public schools in Oklahoma must teach the Bible? Now, these things are in court now, they're being contested, and rightly so, but that has been the proclamation from the State Secretary of Education. The state of Louisiana has mandated that every classroom, public classroom in the state, will bear the 10 Commandments. They didn't articulate exactly which version, but they said every classroom will have it. That too is in the courts. How do we understand Supreme Court decisions like Kennedy versus Bremerton? You remember that Kennedy was the Bremerton, Washington football coach who, after every game, pulled the team together for a prayer after the game in the middle of the football field. High school teachers public high school teachers are agents of the government. They are publicly funded and therefore agents of the government. No law respecting establishment of religion, right? So, the Supreme Court took the case and said, I'm reading from Edwin Chemerinsky's recent book on No Democracy Lasts Forever. Chemerinsky is the dean of the law school at Berkeley. He's written on constitutional issues forever. He's quite excellent. But he says, increasingly, the current Supreme Court says that the Constitution's meaning is limited to the framers' views and the public's understanding at that time. In a June 2022 decision, the court, interpreting the clauses of the First Amendment concerning religion, declared that the line that courts and governments must draw between the permissible and the impermissible has to accord with history and faithfully reflect the understanding of the founding fathers. Now, historical records are often not entirely clear about what they meant during the promulgation of the Constitution and in the colonial era. So you would think that alone would lead the justices to say, maybe that's not the best foundation for interpreting these decisions. But as we've discussed already, these guys were friendly to faith, but they weren't exactly devout Christians. They would not have recognized the agenda of Ryan Walter or the state of Louisiana as being a legitimate pursuit of government. So what we're seeing now in that case and in some others is that the court is overturning decades, really almost a century and a half of precedent in terms of the wall of separation. So the first half of make no law respecting an establishment of religion is now taking second seat to prohibiting the free exercise thereof, the free exercise clause. And they are interpreting that to mean that the wall of separation cannot prevent any expression of the free exercise clause. So if the coach wants to put pressure on the players who said in court they felt pressure to go pray, then that's perfectly constitutional. So I know I'm running out of time, so let me try to wrap up quickly with these couple of thoughts. As we think about where we are in the United States and where we're going to be well after November the 5th, this election will not end on November the 5th. We're going to be confronted by individuals who will continue to pursue this agenda. If Donald Trump wins, their work will be made easier. Those are people like the right-wing watch of People for the American Way is alerting all of us to folks like Tim Dunn and Ferris Wilks. These are two Texas preachers who also happen to be oil billionaires and who are using their money to promote this agenda that we must return to this Christian roots as they see it. And that is in accord with these ideas of the New Apostolic Reformation folks. Their ultimate goal is to establish a theocratic government, not just in Texas, but across the United States. And they're doing this on an historically inaccurate view of how the Constitution came about. The New Apostolic Reformation came about around 30 years ago, and they have a declared program that they refer to as the domination of the seven mountains. And this seems to be a reference to Revelation chapter 17, in which the seven mountains are references for the seats of power, and so on and so on and so on. But they seek to control the seven mountains: family, education, media, religion, entertainment, business, and government. And when you look at the decisions that are being made by the courts, it's working. Donald Trump's chief religious advisor is Paula White King, a Floridian who is active in the New Apostolic Reformation. And she, along with folks like Dutch Sheets of South Carolina and Cindy Jacobs in Texas, are prime movers in the New Apostolic Reformation. They are the ones who have developed this mythology that Trump is Cyrus, Cyrus being the Persian king who freed the Jews from Babylon. He was a flawed man. He was in many ways a wicked ruler, but he freed the Jews from Babylon. In their mind, Trump will do that for America. He will free the seven mountains from the wayward ways in which they are going and free America for this vision of this theocratic government. This is not Billy Graham to Richard Nixon. This is much, much deeper and more troubling. But what are we going to do about it? Couple of things. And I'll mention these two. Heather, may I have that next slide? 1947, a group of Methodist ministers and others, but it was primarily a group of Methodist ministers, got together to form Americans United for Separation of Church and State. And their goal has been and continues to be ensuring that freedom of conscience and freedom of religion are respected in the way the Constitution intended. They have been working, and I learned about this from Dr. Quam. Oh gosh, 6 weeks or so ago, I guess it was now, about the next group that is at work here in Kansas called the Mainstream Coalition. Mainstream has been partnering with Americans United for Separation of Church and State. Tomorrow night, Shanae and I will be at a Project 2025 card writing event up in Shawnee. But here in Kansas, that group is trying to be a strong voice to counter what is going on out there. And in Oklahoma, I had a chance to visit with this group last year, the Oklahoma Faith Network. They're doing similar kinds of work in Oklahoma, and they are active and they are working hard against some terrible odds. In some ways, I admire them more than any of these groups because they are confronting folks like Ryan Wall. So those are things that I would suggest to you if you're interested and concerned about some of these issues. Those are three organizations that could use your help. They are trying to turn the tide on the misinformation and the misunderstandings that are being shared around the country right now. I know I've gone a little past the time I was supposed to go. Dean Betchworth, I apologize, but we still got time for a few questions, I hope.
Thank you, President Simmons. Would you like to go ahead and moderate your own questions, please?
I'll be glad to. Be glad. Any questions I can try to respond. I don't mean you go out here depressed. It's challenging, okay? They are attacking the fundamentals of our republic. It is challenging, to say the least. There are a lot of good folks out there fighting a good fight too, and we can help.
I don't have a question right now, but I do have a comment. Well, two comments actually. The one is, I think it's really intriguing that you use the language of trying to turn the tide, given your preference of college football teams.
It's just a good word. You want to use as often as you can.
Yeah. But it is a really great image, I think, and both in how impossible turning tides can be, and also this sense of that kind of longue durée that's prepared us to be at this time while many of us slumbered. Things were happening, and so I really want to give the comment that you're telling this sweep is very helpful for understanding where we are, and the way you've highlighted certain occasions, but certain thinkers and ideas that now are kind of like the water we swim in. That's really a helpful telling. So thank you for that.
Thank you. Thank you. These ideas from the Enlightenment are just so common to us that we don't see them anymore. And we forget how important they are in terms of the building blocks of this republic, which heaven knows it's got problems, but.
More in the chat.
How do you respond to congregations when members have been radicalized? You know, that's a question I've heard from some of our alums too. One response that I heard that I think could be helpful. This particular pastor, who is in a small church in a kind of a rural community, started a sermon series on what does it mean to be United Methodist, and started talking about what's in the social aspects of the Book of Discipline, And what does this mean in terms of where our church comes from and who we say we are? I would like to tell you that everybody went, oh yeah, that changed my mind completely. Gosh, how could I have been so prone to error in my understandings? But at least it gave a foundation to respond. The difficulty I think that we have in terms of our national dialogue right now, did you all see the shouting match between the Harris supporters and the Trump supporters at the McDonald's when Trump was serving French fries the other day? We're at a moment where I worry that on both sides, we have forgotten how to engage in dialogue. And there were numerous clips of Democrats shouting wild things at the Trump supporters and wild things being shouted back. There was no common ground. We may be at a moment when too many of us are no longer susceptible to logic and reason. And that's the really terrifying part. If we reach to borrow Malcolm Gladwell's phrasing, a tipping point, we will lose the republic. That's why I think our answer lies in what this pastor is trying to do, what groups like Mainstream Coalition, Americans United, and the Oklahoma Faith Network were trying to do, and trying to create opportunities to have dialogue in a cooler, more temperate manner. Because it's not going to happen on the street at these kind of rallies. And these people don't want that cooled, tempered dialogue. So we have to find ways to create those opportunities. It's a poor answer, but it's the only one I know. Some accessible books. Yeah, you know, that's a great question. And it's a tough one. Social media have so reduced our attention spans as a nation. And I hate to put it this way, but 50 years ago, we had 3 sources of news. And it was all geared toward going to the middle. And we've lost all of that. Let me give some thought about some accessible books. Yes, ma'am.
There's a couple of books written by theologians that I know of. One by Pamela Cooper White on Christian nationalism, and she has questions to use it as a study guide. And Carter Hayward just came out with another one, the 7 somethings. I can't remember the name of it.
Yes.
Yeah.
I've seen a review of that. I can't think of the title right now.
I haven't. I know people who've read it and used it. Also, Dr. Jim Brandt has been teaching in various congregations on Christian nationalism. So,
And that's where
some sources there.
and that's probably where the theological work will be so much better, because you don't want to go to your congregation and start reading Leviathan by Thomas
No.
Hobbes, do you?
Right, exactly. I have a question.
Please, yes, ma'am.
So if I were to ask one of those apostle people, I can't remember the name of the group, where they got the idea that we're of Christian roots, would they refer to the Christianity of the Constitution writers, or would they refer to something further back?
They claim at this point that they want to return to what the framers intended.
Okay, so they do refer to the
They
Constitution.
do refer to the Constitution and the
And
framers.
Jefferson and
yes.
Franklin and, okay,
And it's wrong.
okay.
Now, I don't
Yeah.
doubt that they've been at this since the mid-90s when
Right.
they really started working.
Yeah.
I don't doubt that they have other resources to draw on, but in terms of the Constitution, that's part of their argument,
Okay, thank you.
that we have lost our way in terms of the Christian foundations of the Constitution. All right, well, if there's no more questions, I'll leave you with this. I'm sorry, is there one more?
Yeah, Eric's down at the bottom.
Yeah. The Council of Bishops have struggled to address these issues. Is our very polity working against us now? Maybe. Part of the problem, this is a whole nother consideration. One of the problems that we have in the United States is that the Constitution is not working for us anymore. Despite everything I just said about the Bill of Rights and so forth, the anti-democratic features of the Constitution are not serving us well as a republic. And by that, I simply mean this. You've got the Senate that is an inherently anti-democratic institution.
Right.
The Electoral College is an inherently anti-democratic institution.
Right.
Those elements that were built, and you know, and you understand that because the framers were not keen on democracy.
Right.
They were worried about democracies falling into the trap of demagoguery and authoritarianism, because it happened so often, particularly in Greek history, with Greek democracies falling into dictatorships and so forth over and over again. They were not keen on the idea of democracy. And that had its limitations for a very long time and continues to do so. In an ideal world, we would convene a constitutional convention and do what Jefferson said we needed to do, which is every 50 years or so, the polity needs to come together, rewrite this thing. Not exactly an idea of Holy Writ, right? Get together, rewrite the Constitution so that it reflects the will and the needs of the people at the time. That is the way to maintain a democratic element in the Republic. And it is so terribly hard to amend the Constitution. But how many of us want to run that risk of calling a constitutional convention? It's terrifying.
Yeah.
Don't leave thinking that we're about to be Viktor Orban's Hungary or Vladimir Putin's Russia. Our institutions have withstood a lot. They've seen awful things like a civil war, a couple of world wars, some Red Scares, Joseph McCarthy, Roy Cohn. And we're still here, and we're still able to talk about these issues in a way that we could not if we were in Putin's Russia or Orban's Hungary or even Erdogan's Turkey. So don't despair. These folks are out there doing good work and we can help. So come up to Friction Brewery tomorrow night and you can sign Project 2025 postcards for the Mainstream Coalition, or get in touch with Americans United or the Oklahoma Faith Network. They need our help, and we can do it. Thanks, everybody. You all have been very kind to sit through all this. I appreciate it.
Thank you very much, President Simmons. I noticed that Dr. Narcisse has put a suggestion in the chat of a podcast by Diana Butler Bass, so you might want to listen to that. And we'll also find a way to make some of the resources that Dr. Haft and others mentioned available. So let's show our appreciation to Dr. Simmons for his presentation today. Before we close today, are there any announcements for the good of the community? Any other presentations or events coming up that we need to be aware of? Is Elena nearby that might be able to tell us about chapel next week?
So next Tuesday's chapel will be alumni Angel Garcia, and it should be a very non-traditional, very dialogical, very participatory. So please come to chapel, and please come prepared to not just be a spectator. I hope that doesn't scare you off, because it's going to be amazing.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Elena.
Dr. Betzworth,
Yes.
registration opens on Monday. Students need to make sure they read their email to determine which day their particular registration opens.
All right. Thank you, Dr. Hatcher. Any other announcements? All right. Well, thank you all once again for coming today. Thank you, Dr. Simmons, and you have a good rest of your day.
All right. Yep.